Unmask the supernatural. Explore the history and future of parapsychology. Analyze legends and folklore. And welcome entertaining and informative guests as they probe irresistible mysteries that continue to haunt us. They may not always agree. In fact, they won't. But the dueling parapsychologists provide an investigative podcast that's not afraid to seek the truth and separate nonsense. With your hosts, Elliott Van Dusen and Daryl Walsh. Welcome to the Dueling Parapsychologist Podcast.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Dueling Parapsychologist Podcast. I'm riding solo tonight. Daryl Walsh is out with the flu, but he told me that he might do a short video after he watches this podcast and throw his 2 cents in. He does have one question for Chris that he wants me to run by him here, so we'll get to that a bit later. But with me is Nova Scotia's very own Chris Stiles, UFO investigator. He's got a lot on the go right now. He's working on a new book that's due to come out. He just finished a bigger version of the Shag Harbour Expo down in Yarmouth last year, and they're getting ready for another one this year in October. So, Chris, let's start talking about the conference from last year. You had some big names there, especially Nick Pope, former intelligence officer over in Britain there. How did the event go? What was the dirty details?
It was fantastic. I'll tell you, it was a nail biter up to the end. I mean, we had that second hurricane, Fiona, appear. I mean, we were just coming out of that period with the airlines, Elliott, where, it was starting to improve, but it was still very difficult to get connections. There were lots of cancellations there. We had to rebook flights for Nick Pope, for example. It was kind of scary, and we really wanted him to appear, and he did it. In the end, we got everybody except Martin Willis, and unfortunately, he suffered a health emergency at the last minute. But we're bringing him back this year. But listen, it was a blast. I mean, me, I'm not part of social media, but I've had people sending me some of the pictures that appeared there. The bunch of us walking around the streets of Yarmouth late at night, and sitting there, me and Nick Pope sitting in, I don't know what those little chairs are for with neon tubing around them in Yarmouth they have downtown, just having a chat and that. But it was everything we had hoped for and more. Like, it came together. We had a little better than 100 people. Unfortunately, some people couldn't make it with Fiona and other issues, canceled flights, etc. But everybody was there, had a blast, including the speakers. And it was, I've been to a lot of these things, and we worked for a long time to try to arrange this in a venue like that was appropriate. Unfortunately, there is nothing in Shelburne County, but, being in Yarmouth left us close enough that we had that second day where we took everybody on a bus tour and that. But it was a blast. The speakers loved it. In fact, Nick Pope's coming back this year, for us there. But yeah.
That's great to hear. So this went from usually just being kind of a 2 to 3 day smaller scale event right in the Shelburne, Shag Harbour area where anyone that's listening that doesn't know, on October 4th, 1967, we had a UFO crash off the coast of Shelburne. Sorry, not Shelburne, Barrington, and down in a little fishing community called Shag Harbour, and it's been dubbed Canada's Roswell. And then this year, you guys moved it to Yarmouth at one of the bigger hotels there. Is the Grand Hotel?
Yeah, Rod's Grand Hotel right downtown there.
Rod's Grand Hotel.
Yeah.
And before the flights got messed up from some of your spectators, and the hurricane obviously did some major damage all over Nova Scotia, how many tickets would have sold at the peak of it?
At the peak of it, it was 100. We were approaching toward 200. You know what I mean? We were getting there. But in the end, we had a little better than 100 paying people come in there. And it was, but like I say, it was an enthusiastic crowd. I think people were just really appreciative that we managed to pull it off, through that whole period of COVID. They lacked these things. And to have, such an event here, and to have it even outside Halifax, the people there appreciated that. And it was just like they were kind of surprised when they seen all the big names that appeared in that, and it was a blast. And I had just as much of one. It was the first time I'd met Nick Pope. We'd talked a couple times before. That was it. Some of the presenters were known to me, and we were already friends, like Debbie Ziegelmeyer and Rob Switek and that. But no, I just look forward to it, and I'm very much looking forward to this year. And it was just wild, and it never ended. And we managed to squeeze so much else in, like on the way back. Me and a group of the speakers went over to Oak Island. There was all these great little side jaunts we'd taken, and if you weren't there, you missed one, unfortunately. But we're doing it again next year, and hopefully it'll grow on that. I'll tell you, the community of Yarmouth has really embraced it. We've had their support in terms of patronage, but also, there've been some grants that had come from local government, and they're in with us again, showing their support. The community seemed to really appreciate it. And unfortunately, what we heard when it was all over is that many people just hadn't gotten the word. So we've got to do a better job in that. That's always the challenge, to get the word out to everyone. And, you put on that kind of product and they will come, if they know.
Yeah, I find sometimes like I saw Travis Walton was in New Brunswick maybe about a year ago, and I had only found out about it after the media had reported about the event occurring. But I could see how you would miss people maybe leading up to the event. And that's certainly something I'm keeping in mind as well with our paranormal symposium that's going to be held in October 7th. Now it was supposed to be October 14th, but it is now confirmed Saturday, October 7th from 9 a.m. until 6 p.m. at the Halifax Tower Hotel and Conference Center, which you are one of our guest speakers.
Yes. Yeah, I guess so. Just one more thing I'm looking forward to. I mean, the weekend before that, I'll be, at the Shag Harbour UFO Expo in Yarmouth. It's a bit of an oxymoron misnomer when you mention the two communities, but Yarmouth anyway, the UFO Expo. As it was on the marquee down there, they just simply put it up as UFO Expo. It literally UFO XPO, which is kind of trendy, I guess.
That is cool. That is cool.
Yeah.
So this year, what kind of things are you guys planning for this year? What have you done to expand upon last year's success?
Well, we're basically Friday night, we're going out. There's going to be a meet and greet at some of the local restaurants. They have a whole sort of evening planned, and in a town like Yarmouth and, in that kind of a venue, it's kind of, personal, kind of intimate. And it's going to be a chance for people to sit down with the speakers, and really pick their brains, ask whatever they had. And I'll tell you something, this sounds like a joke, but I think there's more truth in it than, it's the kind of thing you learn. If you ask Nick Pope, why is he coming back? If you caught him at the right moment, he'd probably say the fish cakes. One of the restaurants we went to, he said, they're the best damn fish cakes I'd ever had,
That's hilarious. That's great, though. That's great. And it's great for the town of Yarmouth as well. Bringing in all those people.
The community was good. They loved it down there. We'd go out at night and we'd walk from place to place. It's a great little downtown in Yarmouth. I think the community, they've supported us and they appreciated the effort, and looking forward to going down again, like I say. But anyway, the kind of things we had, so that evening, there's going to be an extended meet and greet where we're kind of walking around going to various locations, right? Saturday is the meat and potatoes of the event. This is the symposium. There'll be speakers all day from morning till up into the night, I believe I'm last. And this year, yes, we've already thrown his name around a few times, Nick Pope, which everyone knows because he seems to be on just about every TV show there is now. But besides him, we have Dean Alioto coming from Hollywood, who's got a new series coming out, UFO series. We've got Paolo Harris coming, who last year was a co-author with the release of the book Trinity with Jacques Vallée, right? Very much looking forward to meeting her. There's somebody else who I've talked with and had dealings, but I've never met personally yet, right? And Martin Willis is coming, podcaster extraordinaire. I mean, Martin, he's been every week had something out there for 10 years, that's new on there. And, he's been a big supporter of the case in my work. And, we'd be remiss not to have him back. Last year, unfortunately, he had a health emergency right when he was about to travel here, but he's looking forward to coming. We have talked, and he's just great. And he's got so many experiences and stories to tell with the guests he's had here.
That's phenomenal. And this year, it's going to be September 29th and 30th and October
correct
1st.
At the Yarmouth Grand sort of thing. You can buy tickets, or you can just browse the event right now and see what you think about it at Shag Harbour UFO Expo.com. It's the dedicated site that's on there. It's up there last year. It's updated for the 2023 event, and it answers most of your questions. And if not, you send an email in. Somebody, probably Danny Reed or somebody else in the society, gets back to you pretty quick, and gives you any additional information you need. One of the latest additions we've added, they're not even on the website yet, is we managed to secure as a speaker this year Travis Walton. And I'm looking very much forward to that, because the thing is with Travis, I know you missed him in New Brunswick. I missed him in New Brunswick. But over the years, a couple times we were to appear when I used to travel more and go a lot to the U.S. He was on the list, but ended up getting double booked or whatever, and we've never actually met. I know I missed him in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I think 10 years later I missed him in Trenton, New Jersey or something, So we'll finally get to meet, chatting with him on the phone, and it's been very interesting, securing the arrangements. But so I don't know, did I get everybody there? We got Travis, Paolo, Dean, Eliotto, Martin,
Nick Pope.
Nick's coming back, and I guess I'm the sixth one here.
That's great. And I see that the tickets are going to be sold through Eventbrite. They are not currently for sale right now, but it will be coming soon. And the prices, I'm just looking at it here. The full 2-day expo ticket is $250. That includes all taxes and fees. And the early bird pass Sunday bus tour is $115. Yeah. And you can also attend the Saturday sessions only for $160.
Yeah. Or you can come into one speaker if it comes to it. I think, if there's room available, and there usually is, that's an option too for people. Like, you might want to come and just see whoever your personal favorite is, sort of thing, in the field. But it's a wild and crazy thing, and I'm looking forward to it. Last year I gave them a bit of a tease, but this year I have a whole lot of new material to cover, and I'm looking forward to that, and just see how that plays out too, so.
That'll be great. Again, Chris mentioned the website, but it's Shag Harbour UFO Expo.com. We'll put it on our social media, and anyone watching the YouTube version of this podcast, I'll put the link up as well. That's great. That's great. Yeah. Great news. Speaking of UFOs, there's been a lot of stuff going on here currently right now in the media. We've kind of gotten a little bit more information now. It seems like the objects that were shot down, 4 objects that were shot down by mostly the U.S. government, a bit of Canadian involvement, seems to be kind of benign objects now. But about a week or two ago, anyone was guessing from spy satellites, spy balloons to alien aircraft. But some new information's come out. So what's the latest on what's going on here, Chris?
Well, the latest I've heard, and this is all kind of subject to change. They probably got the analysis of the first one right, which caused the first shoot down, which is that probably was a espionage attempt, a Chinese spy balloon, essentially. The other ones they're saying now are probably commercial, like weather balloon or some kind of, private industry thing. God knows, could have been watching anything from weather to ocean conditions, and they happen to pass over. The danger of those items, though, which wasn't a danger from the Chinese one because it had sufficient altitude, but the others were right in the wrong altitude you want for commercial traffic, which, they did present a clear and present danger. And the fact is, if the fact that NORAD or any of the authorities or air forces involved in our airspace here in Canada or the US were unaware of who launched these or what the mission was, and they don't know. I think most of this was just perhaps a bit of, vagueness and unfortunate terms that were thrown around a little too easily by the media, So a lot of people were starting to think, could they be, something unconventional that was shot down? And then again, that's kind of a scary thought too, when you think about it. That's not the our modern world. That's not the vision of Steven Spielberg. That's more like a 50s B movie, where you shoot it down, you ask the questions later. What did we shoot down?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this. Especially I always follow any news related to Mars, the planet Mars. I love that planet for some
Me
reason.
too.
And
very much
so we send probes to other planets. We send we've had a probe land on Venus. The Russians did anyway. We have probes and robots and drone. Even a drone on Mars now that can fly. Ingenuity. That's the thing. It seems like even before this happened, it seemed like the U.S. government, once they found the Chinese spy balloon and they shot that down, then they started kind of panicking and they shot down, the three other objects. We know from our history in ufology that fighter craft have aggressively gone after UFOs. But I find it interesting because what if an intelligent extraterrestrial society is sending, probes or things like that to scout out this Earth, because we do the same thing, especially with the James Webb telescope. We're looking at different galaxies and we're trying to figure out which planets are habitable. What if another intelligent race out there has, picked on Earth and they've sent these probes here, and automatically we're just getting the US government and other governments to go out and shoot these things out of the sky? I mean, I think that is kind of a dangerous line to go, because it's kind of sending back a message that, wow, this is a very hostile planet and very hostile people that we're dealing with here.
Sure.
What's your take on that?
Well, I don't think that these balloons were likely, any of these sightings so far, any of the shoot downs, were anything unconventional or extraterrestrial in nature. I think that any kind of extraterrestrial probe would be, if it's operating properly, would be harder to detect, not as noticeable, more stealthy. But then again, there are plenty of sightings, and there are plenty of sightings of things that are unknown or unexplained. So it is a possibility. I should point out that, when you look at the military history, sometimes you have to kind of examine their motivations. And believe it or not, balloons have been a threat in the past. In World War II, in fact, yes, a lot of Americans died in the attack on Pearl Harbor, in the war with Japan. However, the only people to ever die from enemy action in that war on the mainland of the U.S. were those that met their death by rice paper balloons that were sent over from Japan. School children would make rice paper balloons under direction from teachers, and they would be filled with hydrogen, and booby trap bombs would be attached to them. And one of the reasons they were able, as flimsy as these things were, to traverse the Pacific, was the fact that the Japanese knew about the jet stream, and at the time, the Western world didn't. And one of the big puzzles that the Americans had was trying to figure out, how are these balloons making it to the coast of the U.S., right? And there was one case where they were called Fugo balloons, F-U-G-O, and one of these Fugo balloons landed in a field, and some kids were having a picnic, and they ran over to one and tried to pick it up, and it exploded. And I believe there were 6 deaths or something like that. But anyway, that was the only enemy action. This is from a rice paper balloon, right? And it's funny how here's a strange thing where the Americans were advanced and had a technique. What they did, at the same time, and it was a few years later, even after the war, they were unaware of the jet stream. In fact, the Stendeck UFO case, or what was thought to be a UFO case, where that airliner crashed in the Andes and came out the end of a glacier, what was it, 50 years later, that case there, that crash happened because they didn't know about the jet stream and were flying against it and assumed with no visibility, that when they dropped out of the cloud cover, they'd already gone over the Andes, but they hadn't because they were fighting the wind away. Anyway, here's the quick lesson that is amazing, how the U.S. at the time didn't know about the jet stream. But you know how they found where the fugal balloons were being made and how they put it into it? Some of the fugal balloons they found had bags in it for ballast that would be dropped later or whatever. It had sand in it. And they took a sample of the sand and looked at geological records from geologists that had studied Japan. And by the consistency of the sand and the minerals in it, they were able to identify which beach the sand had come from. They figured the factory was nearby, and they went over and bombed the factory. And that was the end of the fugal balloons. They were able to do that, but it was years later before they understood the jet stream. So, balloons can be a threat. Some people said the UFO appeared balloon-like, although in the images I've seen, it didn't, over the Santa Monica Hills in World War II. And it wasn't doing anything that was lethal. But when it appeared in the sky, the Americans shot so much AAA at it, anti-aircraft weapons, and so much howitzers and things at it, that the shells falling killed 6 people in their homes in the Santa Monica Hills.
It's such a fascinating time, because it almost feels really like almost like we're back in the Roswell days, but moderate, because you've got the same thing happening here. You've got the government shooting down objects. You've got apparently they can't recover one of them. I wasn't sure if it was the one that went in Lake Huron or if it was the one up in the Yukon there, but they said that they basically suspended the search for the object. They can't find it, and they said they may never know exactly what it is. I was interested in why all of a sudden these objects are showing up now, but I did read a news article where what happened is they've upgraded the radar system in North America, and so it was detecting slower moving objects, and that's what was happening, is these slower moving objects were appearing on radar.
You know what? Elliott, upgrades to radar is one of the things where it happens quite frequently. Technology keeps becoming more rapid, the development of it. And one good example of that is, in the Pentagon release about the carrier sightings, right? When you have the sightings that were done in the Pacific, and the objects there, the jets did not have any radar returns, right? But just several years later, I think it was 2014, the ones from the Teddy Roosevelt in the Atlantic, 100 miles off Virginia, the upgraded radar on the F-16s and F-18s could pick up these were the UFOs they were seeing that were like a sphere inside a cube, and were kind of similar to what I'd witnessed with a bunch of other people one day down off Cape Sable Island there. And, so we could do that, but, if whoever, is piloting or controlling these objects or programming them, if they're unmanned or unoccupied, then I'm sure, it's all like any battle here, it's a battle of technologies. Things quickly become ancient and redundant, and then the next development has to come along. But it's interesting that something, and that's very clearly in those cases, I think they're both quite genuine, those carrier-based sightings in the U.S., that the Pentagon had released, that, that we were able to increase our technology to the point of detecting them with radar, but I'm sure that'll be quickly disappear. But like I say, you go 10 years before that, we could not, right? Do you know that in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia here, that there was an attempt to shoot down a UFO here in the 50s, right, by Shearwater? They kept 2 Avenger planes. We called them Harvards, like the ones that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, right? We had 2 Harvard aircraft here with little rockets on them that were on standby. This story is told in Don Ledger's book, the Maritime UFO Files. And, when these things returned, there's quite a famous radar case from 1950. I have all the paperwork. In fact, it's the only UFO file I found in Canada that began marked, above top secret, and over the years have been downgraded, and eventually released. And the report I have is just about the radar sighting and how serious they took. They brought down people from the Defense Research Board, professors from Dalhousie, studied this, manned the radar base at the old air station overnight, with technicians and everything. But the decision at the end was they kept a couple planes on standby with rockets. They figured they'd shoot one down if it came back. And apparently one came and the attempt was made, but they couldn't even close on it. They couldn't get near it, and this thing was gone. But that was a local case from 1950.
Interesting. I do find like obviously there's been UFO reports where the object's been stationary or moving very slowly, but generally when we hear about UFO sightings, usually they're very fast, and whenever a fighter jet's involved, they can't seem to match its capabilities. So when this was all happening, it sounded like it was very slow. We had just had the Chinese balloon, so I was thinking that it was kind of leaning more along the lines like it's a probe from some sort of foreign country, kind of similar along the same lines of the spy balloon that was shot down. But it was interesting because there was two things that I heard that really got me kind of thinking too. One was that one of the objects had string or rope dangling down from it, and the government had come out and said that it looked like it had at some point had some sort of payload which was no longer attached. And you had talked about those rice balloons, and one of the objects over Lake Huron. The same thing could happen. You could have somebody drop a biological agent into Lake Huron, which has drinking water for almost 3 million people.
That's right.
Basically a terror attack kind of thing. And so I could see why the government took it seriously. The other interesting thing, though, and I'm not sure if you heard this too, but it might have been the object over the Yukon. Two of the fighter jets had gone up to intercept the object, and one of them was reporting interference with his equipment, while the other pilot wasn't, which is kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, I hadn't heard those details, but you got to consider how often that happens. That could be one of our aging jets too, for that matter. Things do go wrong. The amazing thing is that so often things do go right. But there's some other possibilities here. My main takeaway from this, I think, I did an interview in the Herald. They did an article on this about them, I think last week. They called me up, but the fact that they were shot down successfully, I think, argues against the extraterrestrial nature. Because my experience when I've seen things that appeared like balloon-like, including the orb sighting I had in 2018, one of the things I've noticed is that, I'm sure that one of the features I witnessed is I find in those orb sightings is if you don't have quick, almost instantaneous acceleration maneuvers in that for evasive action, then the other thing you have is they're there and they're gone and they're back. They seem to dematerialize, which is what I'd witnessed, right? In fact, 3 times I've seen the thing disappear and reappear the day we were having that hour and 20-minute sighting in Clark's Harbor. So the fact that there was something that maintained there and was shot down, I think argues against an extraordinary nature of it in this case. But there's other possibilities here that they haven't even looked at. One of the things I thought of is that, if something wasn't Chinese, these other objects, yes, they could be commercial. But, you could have had a diesel electric sub just off the coast from North Korea, surface and simply launch one of these things. You know what I mean? For their purposes, to get updated surveillance on us.
Absolutely. Another thought that popped into my mind too is somebody testing response times as well.
Sure. We've all gotten soft and slow, and there was so much emphasis on civil defense and the Red Menace, and things could erupt at any time in the Cold War. I remember that as a child. You could, even children, you were well aware of that tension. But But nowadays, it's thought that's unlikely. But then again, just a few years ago, I used to wonder myself, and many people would argue, why does NATO keep so much stuff? Why do we contribute to overseas? People would say, clearly, there's not going to be another land war in Europe. And look where we are now.
Yeah.
You know
No,
what I mean? It
that's
seemed
very true.
unlikely, and there hadn't been one in an awful long, well, I suppose Kosovo, and there's a war we were in, and it's referred to over there as a war. And I can remember for a long time, this was in the Krejcand years, the government here denied it, but there were pictures on the front of the newspaper, and I can remember in Kosovo, they laughed at it when they said the Canadians are coming, but that was a real shoot 'em up little war when they got there. That wasn't just peacekeeping duty, and in coverage I've seen even in Europe that was done by the other nations there. When you'd see an English broadcast, it was quite funny. They're worried about the Canadians, and they seen how much back and forth and how much actual combat fighting there was. And I had to laugh. One of the articles I was watching at the end, they were saying, "Oh my God, the Canadians are coming. We're worried. We're terrified." It says at the end, the guy had to grin, the newscaster. He said, apparently they hadn't been to a hockey game, but
Interesting.
yeah.
You had mentioned about the Pentagon releases, and I find this interesting. It frustrates me with our government because it's not just with UFOs; it's with anything, even
Sure.
police files. Like I love listening to homicide. I used to be a homicide detective with the RCMP. I did major crimes for 8 years, I think, in total. 8 out of my 15 was spent doing major crimes. So in homicides in Canada, we don't really say anything except for the fact that there's a criminal investigation ongoing and that the matter's before the court, and we can't say anything.
Well,
where down the States, they'll tell you what weapon was used, what happened, all that stuff. I noticed during these objects that the U.S. Continued being more. They were given descriptions of the objects. They were giving information out. Whereas when Trudeau and his people below him were speaking about these objects, very, very little detail was being given.
Yeah, it's quite vague, and they got lampooned for it even on This Hour Is 22 Minutes, as so they should. Yeah, but I mean,
now, do you think that if this was a real UFO that we know that they've sent fighter jets after when they detect them? Sometimes they're not detectable, but when they do detect them, do you think we would even be hearing about this, or do you think they
I
would
don't.
keep that quiet?
I don't I can bring this back to our coast and cases I've looked into, but no, I don't think we would. The only time you hear about cases is when they cannot be hidden. That they're in the public eye. I mean, I can even go back to Shag Harbour, but even recent cases, you don't tend to see, if they don't have to release, if they don't have to inform you, if they don't have to mess with it, then they don't, It's like right now, officially, there's no one that's really investigating UFOs. There's not a division that has to respond to the public, right? At the same time, there are investigations into UFOs. There's no choice. Like I've said, if you're an air traffic controller and something enters the air near the airspace that doesn't have a transponder code and is getting threateningly close to the aircraft with all those people aboard, and you can't account and it suddenly disappears, there'll be a follow-up investigation. Now, it's into a UFO incident, but they're not going to keep stats. They're not going to release things to the public. If they do, it'll be very limited, and downplayed. It's like I've often said about the force, like with the RCMP. They're a disinterested third party, and when you guys would be called in to investigate something in modern times, it'd be like you would as if it was a theft or a murder or any other crime. You just come in, write what you see, do what you do, make sure people are safe, It's a UFO investigation. And I love those forms that used to say at the top, complaint of UFO. I think that really sets the tone for it there. But still, you have to respond to it. You don't get that choice. Like you guys have paper on everything. You got to fill up a gas tank. It's got to be accounted for, and the
Yep.
standards are high here in that sense. It's not like the county sheriff in some county in Maine that can just say, yeah, okay, that's enough to help, it, done.
Yeah, no, for sure. And even today, if somebody was to call dispatch and say that they see a light in the sky, a file would still be generated. RCMP would still
That's right.
and investigate. It just wouldn't be as standard. Like back then, they had actual policy on reporting it. And you had to notify D&D and stuff like that. They've kind of gotten a bit away from that, but
Sure.
they still would do that. I know even when I was in the RCMP, there was a couple of UFO cases, even just one up in when I was up in Yellowknife, there was one up in Delaney where the member was on call, and I wrote about it in my book, More Supernatural Encounters from Law Enforcement. The member was on call and got a call from dispatch saying that there was a UFO being reported by the locals with a tractor beam or a beam of light coming down from it, and he laughed when he got the call. He's like, "Yeah, right. Like this has got to be a prank." And when he looked out his window, he actually saw it for himself, and he's like, "Oh, geez, I better suit up and take a look." They went out. There was three of them. They went out. They investigated for hours. They did all their usual stuff because, like you said, they're a third party, independent.
That's right.
They're there working, and they get a call, and they're mandated by the RCMP Act to respond and to do their job, and that's what they do. And these guys called Edmonton Air Traffic Control, Yellowknife Air Traffic Control, other government agencies. They check the weather, see if there's any storms or any balls of lightning or anything like that happening. And the one thing I didn't know when I was in Yellowknife, I did know that they flew all the guys in to Yellowknife to meet with management and be debriefed by the about the incident. But what I didn't know is that they sent up a CSIS agent as well that was investigating that particular sighting as well, which was interesting. But they would still investigate today, which is cool. Just unfortunately that in our Canadian society, we just don't release many details to the public.
No, and I'll tell you where a lot of it ends up. One of the problems in the system now, I don't know if this has been tweaked in the last few years, but generally speaking, like you say, if an RCMP officer had been dispatched to investigate a sighting or more than one, whatever is in this case, generally speaking, those reports that they generate afterwards sit in the detachment for about a year, and then they would be sent to RCMP headquarters, and they'd sit there 2 or 3 more years, and then they get turned over to Library and Archives Canada, as it's now called, formerly National Archives. Once it gets there, it goes into a black hole. And if you're lucky, it surfaces 15 to 20 years later in a collection that'll become available to the public. In the meantime, it becomes inaccessible, right? And for example, that led to the little adventure I had when I got the space object contingency plan released, because I had called the RCMP, when they would send an answer. In those days, I used to use the telephone, and I would call after hours because they had to respond to it on their dime in those years before calling plans, right? And I can remember them calling back and they had a complaint, and they said, no, Chris, your timing's real bad. We just cleaned up the files. We transferred a whole bunch, which I believe was true. I was looking for a certain case, but since I've been in this sort of long term and just going, another opportunity come up. She says, the only thing we got is some old policy documents here that go back to the 40s, something called the space object plan or something. And geez, I leapt off the couch and I said, that's it. That's what I want. And the officer on the other end there, Corporal Lachance, she said to me, no, I have your request in front of me. It's not that. And I'm just trying to think of something, and I'm saying, well, I just didn't know what it was called, but that's it. And she said, well, you'll have to send in another request, and I said, well, I will. And I sent it in. I said, however, if you had it the other day, like you say, could you go and get me the file number? Because, you're dead in the water without the file number.
Yeah, the more information you have, like you said,
yeah.
the better it is. And I remember when you got it, though, I still probably have a copy in my file cabinet here in my office.
Yeah. But I mean, I loved how it had scripts in it too, as to how to handle the media and all that. It was interesting. But, you could hear her heels clicking up the hall and she come back. But when I called back, I think it was 2 days later, I got a call from the chief archivist at the time. That was Sergeant Maurice Laferriere, and he called and said he didn't know what I was talking about. And the file number didn't make any sense. And I said, I'm sure it's right because, Corporal Lachance read it to me a few times and I checked. And, well, I'll have to talk to her and see. And, anyway, he called back and said, yeah, I think we can help you, but it won't be done under the act. Which
Yeah.
kind of threw me because there wasn't enough time. Right.
Yeah. No, for sure. And what you said too about the file retention and how they transfer the files off is true. So when I worked there is a time period assigned to a type of file. So for example, a murder file would never be purged off the system.
No.
It would remain indefinitely.
Yeah.
You'd always have records of it. But a call for a drunk and just a drunk person in public, that file and that electronic version of that file may only exist for about 5 years, and then we have civilians that go on and purge it. And so once it gets purged, like it's gone.
But I believe you guys have a guide. There's what they call a retention schedule.
Yes, there is. There's retention schedules.
Schedules. Yes.
Yeah, and each different type of crime or file has like a different amount of time that we have to keep the file. But that's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure what the UFO sighting retention is set at, but
no, and I don't know what it is with RCMP, but I have a much better idea in terms of the military how that works, and of course the different forces in the military employ it differently, and it can become a real problem in matters that involve the Navy. And of course I know all about that because some records are not deemed official records. It's like I've struggled and recently on the Shelburne case where I made major breakthroughs, which is leading to the new book coming out, is the fact that, only the official deck logs of the ship are considered official records. A captain's log, right? Or a supplementary log or purser's book or anything else, paperwork, they are actually usually destroyed on a retention schedule. The deck logs are kept forever, but they're considered the only official one Now, interestingly, when I talked to the U.S. Navy, you got firm answers. Like if you said, well, when would the captain's log be destroyed? 11 years later.
Yeah.
Upon we receive it. When you asked the Canadian Navy, it was a little vague. They weren't sure, but it would be destroyed. I was assured, So again, there's a discrepancy between our two countries, but
definitely. Yeah. I do. Like in some regards, like with the policing stuff, I'm actually a little surprised that they release so much details down in the States, because I know in Canada it all has to do with not compromising your file. You don't want certain pieces of information out there because especially if it's holdback information and only the killer knows, or or select few of people know. So that kind of makes sense. But it's interesting trying to find that balance, especially in today's world where everyone wants answers. Like, people are tired of the government telling them what to do and when to do it and how high to jump. Like, people want accountability today, and people want answers.
Most people feel, that they get a little miffed about it. And often I hear the expression, hey, what's going on? We're not children.
Yeah. Now, my last question before we get into your details on your new upcoming book here is, and I work for the government, so I know that they have some major screw ups at times, and just
really,
there's some incompetence within the federal government for sure.
Oh yeah.
After hearing about the object that we shot down, that we don't know what it is, and they did a couple days worth of searching, they couldn't find it, and they just threw their hands up and they don't know what it is. Going back to something like retrieving a disc in the desert of Roswell, New Mexico, do you think that the government is more switched on when it comes to something like that? Or do you think, because it kind of, like, I see how they struggled with this object here in 2023 with all the technology we have and all that stuff, and I think back to, like, if they're trying to recover something like a crash disc from another world, and they're having trouble just trying to find what they just shot down, it kind of makes me wonder, like, did they really recover a disc at Roswell? Like, what do you think about their capabilities?
the capabilities of what, the armed forces or the government to
Yeah,
control the scenario, or
the
which way?
government, whoever would be in charge of retrieving such a disc, whether it's your military, I guess, military, Air Force, or some other branch, black ops branch of the government. Do you think that they would be capable of retrieving a disc, where we just saw, like, recently with this incident, where they can't find the object that they shot down, and they just kind of threw their hands up in the air?
Well, when you look at the claims, the facts that we know, and the myth and everything else that comes out of cases like Roswell, it's a difficult scenario to really. I'm not sure that you can even get an answer anymore. I'm not sure anybody in the government can get an answer. When you hear these stories, like when Barry Goldwater asked, like, hey, what's really going on? Do we have a crash saucer? Do we have, and he was told not to ask these questions anymore, and this sort of thing. The point is, I think one of the things I think that's really clear, like in the United States scenario, for example, is the fact that politicians come and go, and that these things are really controlled by career people within the intelligence community.
Mm-hmm.
I think that and it's quite obvious when you look at the horror stories of how they behaved in war scenarios and outside the country. The CIA, for example, it had a large black budget, but it was quite clear that how can I put this? The reach was unbelievable. First of all, I've seen the CIA working in the school systems here in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I can give you specific examples of how people may find this hard to
Well,
believe.
even just the other night, I was having trouble sleeping, and I got onto talk, like, spies, like how countries spy on each other, and basically like embassies and diplomats, like
Oh, hell yes.
a lot of diplomats that are there to
Yeah.
do research or whatever are actually intelligence officers spying
Yeah.
in your country. So then I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder like how many different countries are in Canada with embassies, and when you looked at it, like,
Yeah.
we've got multiple different embassies,
Sure.
and a lot
And
of them do counterintelligence and intelligence work.
yeah, and that was our primary way of spying in the days long before CSIS and this sort of thing. These things were often, it would be some protocol officer sent over to an embassy. This is where a lot of the, if we had an active mission to hand out, that's how it was done. Was through the embassies, or people that were associated with it or had working relationships with the people in the embassies.
Mm-hmm.
There would probably be agents that were sent in, moles that were, unconnected with it, but would have had a friend, a contact in with the embassies, because remember, they just can't enter that space and everything. That's how it was done in the old days, for sure. And to a certain extent, it probably still is by smaller nations, and it's probably a backup used by, Great Britain, Canada, Russia, etc., China, no doubt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But one of the things when you ask me about Roswell and that, who's in, the thing is, who's in charge? Those intelligence agencies right after the war, they were just kind of coalescing and come together. And in fact, I learned quite a bit about it working on this regular book, because Canada was in kind of a unique situation at the time. But when you look down there, I mean, you got to remember, first of all, in the States, there wasn't even an Air Force. The Air Force was part of the Army then. It was the Army Air Force that Stanton used to point out about Roswell.
Yeah, now they're all broken up into your different branches. Well, we know who would respond to a UFO crash in Canada, because, I mean, you are there probably one of the biggest experts on Shag Harbour UFO crash, and there we had the Canadian Coast Guard, we had the Royal Canadian Mounted Police,
Sure.
we had the U.S. Coast Guard, I believe, the navies, both Canadian and American navies involved.
That's right.
So there was a lot of different branches within the government that were involved in searching for that downed craft.
Yeah. And, one of the great mysteries of that has finally come up, because, many people, and I didn't know enough to say definitively this wasn't the case. A lot of people thought this Shelburne story, which emerged, and by the way, that story came out the very first day I made the first effort to investigate Shag Harbour. The Shelburne story was there from the beginning.
Yes. So let's get into your book, because we were always under the impression, and you had sent me your book cover and the back of the cover, and now after just reading that, I noticed that the Shelburne incident appears to have occurred 7 years before the Shag Harbour incident.
Absolutely, and
so what happened there? Because we were always under the impression that October 4th, 1967, object crashes in the ocean. You know, we do the searches, we find the mysterious yellow foam on the top surface of the ocean, and we see lights underneath it. Correct. But eventually lights go out, and then the story is that we thought that it may have crept up to Shelburne, where a second disc comes down, helps repair it, and then the two discs fly up and go. So what happened, Chris, during your investigation?
Well, what we know now is that last part of the story that everybody wanted to join, and I didn't know enough to stop it, but I always was suspicious of it, which is why I kept looking, right? And over the years, I argued with co-authors and certainly TV producers, directors, publishers, etc. Because what I always felt, here was the problem I had, and the initial source of the story was me, because there were only two people that have heard this testimony. One, the other, Bob McDonald, is now deceased, right? But the thing is that the only thing that it changes in the Shag Harbour story is we don't know where it got away to. You know, but this whole thing about two on the bottom, this is all part of this Shelburne USO story of them two sitting up off the coast of Shelburne. Well, what I now know is that's a completely separate case. And the very first diver I spoke to, which was the first one to bring it up, although I was warned of the story, but I didn't know what it meant, was the chief trainer of the Fleet Diving Unit in the 60s that sent me to them. You know, I went to him and he knew. His name was Guy Fenn. I've not used a pseudonym in the book for him, right? These guys are all deceased now. And, you know, when he sent me there, he said, you know about Shelburne, right? And I kept saying, well, Shag Harbour's in Shelburne County. Is that what you mean? They go, talk to the boys that were there, you know. What I didn't realize is the first diver I talked to had was assigned to both missions. He had a lengthy career. He was 35 years in the Navy. Actually got recruited in 1947, you know, and he was the only one that was involved in both missions. In the book, by the way, I name every diver without a pseudonym in the Shag Harbour case, right? But one of them, what they didn't know, and one of the things that became obvious, this investigation just went in places I never thought it would go. And, you know, for years, this book that'll be coming out hopefully in the next couple of months, I would say, you know, end of April at the very latest, probably before, straightens out is I made a breakthrough, and it was a year ago this New Year's. And this is going to sound crazy, but I had a dream. It was after Christmas, and I dreamt about being a child on the floor living at 98 Arteloni Street and hearing somebody tell this story that the divers had told me to my father. Now, I was preschool, but I had this fuzzy memory, and I'm sure it wasn't exact, and I explain all that in the book. And it got up, and I just completely discounted it. But what it made me do is I was interested. My father had a brief naval career, and I decided to look up because I remember his ship was kind of unique, and I was just wondering how it was classified. And like you in police records and all, you know, the history and the mechanisms of that, I have this fascination with the Navy and ships, and, you know, so I went to look up this, and I just flipped open the laptop and went to Wikipedia and looked up HMCS Cape Scott. And I read about what it was, you know, which was something like a supply ship, but it was more than that. You know, it had a hospital on board. It was a factory ship. It did things. It was 450 feet long, and it was kind of like a supply ship, but more than that, like Provider and Protector had been. But when I read through the ship, at the end, there was this one sentence, you know, when you were going through the service history of the ship, one sentence, and it said that in 1960, it had taken part in a mission off Shelburne called Clear Sweep 5, which was a NATO mission. And And that's all it said. And
So now you're thinking, what is Clear
well,
Speed 5?
at this point, I had spent 29 years at this point looking for something to back up the Shelburne story, because my objection when I would be arguing with a director or an editor, and even they said, well, you went on the last show and you said you thought the Shelburne story was the end of it. Well, I said, it's a possibility. I couldn't say it wasn't. I never felt good about it because, as you know, Shag Harbour has a lot of paperwork documents that back up what happened and the government's belief that it could have been ET, right? And they took it quite seriously. Well, that's fine. But the Shelburne story is not mentioned in any of that. And the biggest problem I had is that if you had, as these guys said, and they would estimate, they would say, oh, dozens of ships, probably 20 ships were there anyway off Shelburne. Well, I kept going to 67 to the Shag Harbour event, and I would move both ways, and I looked through every ship in the bloody Navy, and I could never place anything in Shelburne Harbour. And eventually we heard other stories, and I'd move the time frame and other incidents because, I'd been looking for 30 years. Somebody would come up and say, no, they've combined. They were chasing things off the coast, rapid targets underwater in 62. And, some guy from Terra Nova would tell me, so I'd look up that, or, the Gatineau or whichever ship. And I've been chasing and looking, and many people had helped me with this. I'd gone to Ottawa, I'd waded through this stuff. If you know how many ships' logs I'd gone through, and never could I place a Canadian Navy ship in Shelburne Harbour, let alone 20 on a NATO mission,
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly in Wikipedia, I see that in 1960, in October, a full 7 years before Shag Harbour, there's a NATO mission in Shelburne. Oh, I never heard, So I went online and looked for a little more, and it mentioned that it was a minesweeping exercise that had 8 Canadian ships, actually 9 when you include the large diving tender they use, plus 10 American U.S. warships in Shelburne.
That's a lot of traffic in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you start reading about it, and I thought, well, I got to look into that. But here's the kooky part. When I find that little write-up, it says that the command vessel was HMCS Cape Scott that I looked up. That was Dad's ship. He was a medic on the ship.
Wow.
He never breathed a word of it to me. Right. So suddenly you're like, no. Like, I mean, I was going at the same time, Elliott, in my mind, one part of my head's going, yes, this is it,
Yeah.
And the rest of me's going, no. I mean, the fact that a family member had served on the mission,
Yeah.
And I was absolutely positive that in that year, that was the ship he was still stationed on, So, then you start looking for more. And I spent the next few days going around Dartmouth to secondhand bookstores trying to find old copies of The Crow's Nest, which was the Canadian Navy magazine back in the day. And eventually I found one for December 1960. I figured it would take an edition or two to make it. And there's a write-up about the mission. And it's just very straightforward and explains that it was a minesweeping mission, names all the ships, Canadian, American, that were involved, right? And most of them were minesweepers, but then you had Cape Scott as the command vessel because it was in Canadian waters. And we had a couple of other large vessels, the Blue Throat, and the Americans sent up a countermeasure ship called the Orleans Parish. And then they had another thing, a loop layer called the Yazoo. And so then, since I had all the names of the ship, the next thing I did was go online and look up, see if there was anything under write-ups of those ships just on Wikipedia before I went any further. And immediately I found discrepancies between the Canadian and American version of the mission. Because when you read the Canadian version, it was basically like, yeah, we did this. We love working with our American partners, and we're part of the NATO fleet, and we played a major role, and a good time was had by all, and nothing's wrong. Well, when I read
almost how we do our press releases.
Yes, kind of like that. But when I looked at the U.S. version, it was a different story.
Interesting. And see, again, they're more open with their disclosure
Well,
for
yes,
whatever
I
reason.
mean, but I was interested to find that the Cape Scott had engine failure and was going to run aground in Shelburne Harbor and was saved by the USS Yazoo and towed to a safe place. And then the other ships had broken down and there was some kind of unspecified trouble and this kind of thing, right? So, um, I attempted to start getting ships logs and that. And of course, we were still in the tail end of COVID. Things were moving incredibly slow in
Mm-hmm.
Ottawa. And then I found out that in the Canadian record, like some of the ships I wanted, like the diving tender, the logbook had disappeared. I looked for the Blue Throat. The logbook had not been preserved, they told me. And of course, the most important one would have been the command ship because I was hoping that was, which was Cape Scott. And they said they had that, but months and months were rolling by and nothing was coming. And every time I'd ask, they'd send extremely rude letters to me saying that if I asked again, it would take even longer. I've never had that response before from Library and Archives Canada. But in the
Hmm.
end, I was successful and got the thing. And so the first thing I did was turn to October the 15th, which was when the American record said there was trouble. Oh, this thing was trouble. In fact, orders came from Halifax to get out of the harbor and everything out of Shelburne Harbor immediately. And that's when her engine failed and she was drifting toward the shore.
Hmm.
And they couldn't seem to do anything about it. The Americans rescued them. Well, that was interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Then I went back and looked at my notes from talking to the divers in 1993 when I first had a sit down face to face with the divers that talked about Shag Harbour, right? And the first guy, he's going like, well, you know about Shelburne, don't you? Shelburne was the real deal. Like Shag Harbour's interesting. That was a UFO event, but when we got there, it was all over.
Yeah, yeah.
Shelburne, we came face to face with aliens. And I'm
Yes.
like,
And I was going to ask you that. So in the
yes.
in on the back cover book when I was previewing it,
Mm-hmm.
you had mentioned that there was occupants. So what were you told about that part?
Not a lot. I mean, first of all, when I went for this interview, the home we were at, the guy wasn't going to let us in. He had cold feet. He went down and spoke to Maritime Command, and they said, "Don't talk to this idiot."
Really?
Yes. And he was trying to do it at the door, and I started going into my mode where I call it, I'm tap dancing as fast as I can. I'm just trying to think of something. And the guy's wife, it was the second wife he'd just lost his first, had come to the door and said, "Oh, and I still use a pseudonym for him." And there's reasons for that there. I'll explain that later, maybe, or it's in the book. But anyway,
Yep, absolutely. Even in my
it was
lab work.
necessary. Yeah, it was
Yeah,
necessary
even
in his case, and his partner, the other person in the room, is still alive and has rather important work. Anyway, uh, you know, she says, I've been wanting to hear this all week since he made contact. By the way, this is Good Friday, 1993, which fell into March that year. I forget the exact date. It's in the book, right?
yeah.
And she said, I made coffee and sandwiches and bite them in. Me and Bob McDonald, another researcher, were there, and we went in and sat down. I started talking shop, and I started talking about my dad. And I said, I remember you come to the house. Like him and my dad were tight when the Navy careers coincided. They
Hmm.
drifted apart from repostings. You know how that is in that line of work, like the force. You get scattered, right? But when we were done the meal in Pleasant and talking about all the nasty kind of work and the, talking shop stories about the Navy and the Fleet Diving Unit, I stood up and take the little tape recorder I'd brought, asking to record this, and did a bit of theater and took the back off and let the batteries fall on the floor and said, listen, we're just talking. Like, just tell me what.
Yeah.
And they talked. But when it got to the point where, they were down there, these guys were just in emotional turmoil. Like, and when you hear some of the other stories they had told when we were talking shop beforehand, hauling their dead buddies out of crashed Sea Kings, and divers do nasty work, right?
Oh God, yeah, yeah.
Difficult stuff. But I mean, when we get to the point of what did you see or what's happening there, these guys would look at the floor and they'd start tearing up and they go, we can't talk about that, and it was very puzzling, the reaction. They were, and I can remember Bob sitting there saying something happened. I remember the minute we left the house, he was saying, I think they lost one of them. Something went wrong, like it was so emotional.
Yeah.
And these guys were so serious, you just don't forget those moments, right? So anyway, when I did all this, one of the things he mentioned was he did say that he didn't say they were on a mine-sweeping mission. That would have made this a lot easier over the years of searching. What he did say was that I kept saying, well, why did they send divers down? He said, well, we're fooling around with some new British influence mines they'd sent over. And I had this all still in my notes. And I'm like, so, but anyway, he said, the ships had gotten there to Shelburne and they got assembled and it took all morning to get ready. He said, and when we started, there was an 8-mile dog-leg course they had to get through. And the minesweepers had already gone through and the big ships were going to go through and see if it was clear, or they'd set off these dummy mines, that would alert them. And he said, we were no sooner, he says, it couldn't have been more than an hour into it. We started in the dogleg course toward Shelburne. And he goes, there they were. These things were just there. And we didn't know what was going on below. We knew there was something. The sonar man, they sent us down. And there were 2 UFOs sitting on the bottom. Just there wasn't a lot of detail. He made it sound like classic disc, and there were aliens in the water. And by the way, when he says that, he doesn't just answer. Like every time these guys would say, well, there was, of course, there was like activity. We can't talk about activity.
Yeah.
It was like pulling teeth, getting every next little bit out of them, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, once, up on the surface, they yanked them out. He says all hell broke loose on the ship because they didn't send us any more. And we didn't move. We sat there just watching this for days. We had put down a drop camera. And he said, my buddy here, who's, I got to interview with me, he shot film of it. We took it to the DRB, drove it there in an old Deuce and a half truck called Old Sid, and took it right into them. This is that little brick building on Grove Street in Dartmouth, right?
So that footage probably still exists somewhere.
Oh, yes. But that could be in somebody's drawer, like how I think somebody there handled that the way Philip Corso claimed to handle all the goodies he said he had from Roswell. It was, and there's a whole chapter in the book about that, because when I started investigating DREA, the defense research thing here, that actually preceded the defense research, but that was actually formed during World War II in 1942. And It doesn't operate like the rest. It's kind of a separate adjunct to the Defense Research Board. It's controlled by the Navy, eh? And but anyway, so they tell me all this. So when I finally got the ship's log for HMCS Cape Scott, after I looked at the 15th and seen the lies and the detail discrepancies between the American and Canadian version, next thing I did was dig the file notes out of my file cabinet, which I've since dispersed. I won't even keep in the house now from those interviews. But when I look back saying, okay, it took us all morning, and in the afternoon we started sailing in, we got about an hour in. So I started going, and there was all kinds of entries in this log, because remember, the command ship's controlling these other ships, and and I'm going down, and it's just gibberish, and you got to know the naval jargon, right? Well, the mission starts and it talks about entering swept channel, when they see the odd dummy mine and that, right? I get to 60 minutes in and I'm just reading everything meticulously, making sure I understand, the poor penmanship, how it is, those old records,
Yeah.
And then I get down 60 minutes and I thought, so I'm looking for something that looks like panic. And I don't see it. But when I get to 90 minutes in, 90 minutes on this day, and the day we're speaking of is October the 12th, 1960, there's some communication with Halifax, and the captain makes a special entry, and it says, assume DEFCON 1. That means nuclear war is imminent or has begun, is how that was defined in those days in 1960. It's a little weaker than that nowadays. We had just signed on to the DEFCON system 1 year before, almost to the day, with the Americans. if you look now on Wikipedia or in more scholarly sources than that, and look up or ask the question to your computer, have we ever gone to DEFCON 1? The answer is no.
Right.
That is wrong.
You were saying it is wrong.
That is wrong. This mission with 18 ships off Shelburne, Nova Scotia, declared DEFCON 1 on October the 12th, 1960. That's a fact of history. It's right in the ship's log.
And you got a copy of this through the archives?
I did. Yes.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah. If anyone's going to find something, it's going to be the Bulldog Chris Styles for sure. That's unreal.
I almost missed it because, for the first few years, and me, right away, I started investigating the history of how these things were recorded. DEFCON levels overall were pretty much decided by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, right? But you could raise it for an area, commanders in the field. And the commander in this case was the captain of Cape Scott, right? Captain Rankin, who did that, right? And then afterwards, what do they do? 3 minutes later, they step down from that level, and the ships don't move for 4 days. They just sit, right? Lifeboats are lowered. There's all kinds of things happening. And this is before they have engine failure and all this other stuff's going on. No mention, of course, of aliens, whatever. But, if there's war or you fire something, you don't say why you're firing it in the deck log. When you look at these things, they're very dry, very, it never gives the reasons. It just details everything, right?
I'm just looking at Wikipedia while you're speaking here, too. It says that the U.S. DEFCON level has never been more severe than DEFCON 3, although DEFCON 2 levels in the 1962 for the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, right?
And the 1991 Gulf War, which is interesting because you've got government documents that say...
that's right, that we went to DEFCON 1, Canadian U.S. forces, at Shelburne.
Yeah, it says maximum readiness, immediate response required.
That's right. Yeah, so there's some splaining to do here from somebody.
That's really interesting, yeah.
It is really interesting. It's in there. So, yeah, and I almost missed it because in those days, it was only a couple of years later, they didn't actually write out DEFCON. It would say, assume DC-1. And ironically, that entry is very plain. There's not a chance it was smudged or something erased. It's very clear. And then when you see all the other activity begin, this is probably when the diver was telling me, like, all hell broke loose and the alarms went,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he estimated 60 minutes. And when he told me the story, remember, that's 33 years before when he told me. It's now 62 years later.
Now, during the course of your investigation here, were you able to determine when you said that U.S. ship started to struggle with its engine and kind of went adrift?
No, it was a Canadian ship. It was our command ship. Yeah, Cape Scott. Yeah,
the Canadian ship. Were you able to, through your investigation, determine if the UFO activity had caused that, or was it an actual
I wasn't. No, I'm not able to. No, there's no way we could make that. We don't know the reason. There's many reasons that could happen. However, I will say that ship, even afterwards, was one of the ships, a lot of the ships in our Navy in those days went great distances. That ship, not that long later, went to Easter Island and back without trouble, right?
Without trouble, okay.
Mission there, yeah. So
nothing was definitively linked to the UFO activity in the water, or the USO, I should say, USO, the submerged object,
but
causing the ship.
But to have 18 ships sitting around this, not moving for several days, and assume DEFCON 1. And
did you come across anything where they tried to establish like any sort of communication with the beings that they saw under there?
Well, no, I've got no answers to that. But no, but there's a wealth of things that'll help you determine the possibilities here. One of the things that happened, and by the way, the guy who had designed this mission, he gets flown out. It's an admiral. It's Ken Dyer, a famous Canadian admiral. which, by the way, when you mentioned, you looked up on Wikipedia about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, it's legend here in Halifax, and you could find all kinds of articles in history on there if you go looking about Ken Dyer. He was in charge of the Navy here on this coast for the Atlantic. He was then, and he was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he's the guy who famously went up and met with John Kennedy in Diefenbaker's office with him in Ottawa. And after Kennedy left, Diefenbaker refused to have us support the Americans. He didn't want Canadian ships involved or, you know, to help in the blockade in Cuba or whatever. And Dyer and him had a terrible argument about it. And he left and he came back to Halifax and he contacted Washington and emptied the harbor and just acted like he'd never heard the prime minister say it and took American orders through the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's well documented, right? This guy was, you know, and there's a lot of controversy in articles, you know, pro and con about this. Some said, my God, you know, he circumvented democracy, this guy. He you know, and others speak of him as a hero. It's very controversial in the history of the Canadian Navy, right? But that's who was in charge of this mission. And he was flown out to the Cape Scott and landed and had a meeting with the Americans about this. This didn't happen every day. In 1960, Cape Scott was one of the few ships you could have landed a helicopter on then. You know, it had a big deck. You could even put a Labrador on. The destroyer escorts hadn't been converted. You have to remember the setting here too, Elliott. 1960 is an odd time. It's a world apart from 67. 67 we're in space. In 1960, you got about 3 things in orbit: Sputnik, Explorer, no manned missions yet. Yuri Gagarin is 7 months in the future. People still trusted the government then. It's not like the later 60s. Like that's a big dividing line. Nobody knew about Betty and Barney Hill. We hadn't been in space. And suddenly these divers are telling me that in 1960, they're confronting aliens.
Yeah, Roswell incident would have only been 13 years earlier. So
that's right.
Which is, you know, one of the biggest UFO incidents.
Ironically, the oldest diver and the guy who did the most talking signed up in 47 for the Canadian Navy here.
That is interesting. Yeah.
He had a lengthy career. But here's the other thing is, okay, you got these divers saying that. And I was very critical. And when you'd ask them questions, you know, that would say, well, maybe you misinterpreted. Man, these guys wanted to take a swing at you. It was heated. This was a difficult interview way back in 93. I'll tell you, I got in the thick of it pretty quick. And this was going down to talk about Shag Harbour. And all they wanted to talk about was Shelburne.
Yeah.
And they did talk about Shag Harbour. They pointed me on the way. That led to me finding the documents. Those things weren't as readily available. Now you can get them online, everything. It wasn't like that then.
No,
but,
Jesus. Yeah.
No, I had to fight for that stuff, you know.
Yeah.
But the thing is,
you actually had to get the Shag Harbour documents. I think you had to order microfilm in, didn't you? And you had to go through all.
Oh yeah, we used to get stuff sent to Halifax. The library was very helpful here, the interlibrary loaner system, and then the stuff at St. Mary's. You know, that I had to get permission. Had to go see the Jesuits. You know, because they were at no civilian had seen it outside of you know, the Burke Gaffney papers. I mean, now they're online. You know, it's easy, but back then it took me 6 months to get permission from the archivist there. Meeting with 2 Jesuits that were responsible for his will and the papers he bequeathed, right?
Interesting.
God, I remember meeting you there before you went out for training there in Regina.
Yeah, well, you were the one that told me, switch me on to the Burke Gaffney documents.
Yeah.
I still have in my file cabinet. And then friggin' years later, I found out that not only did Burke Gaffney, so for those that don't know, so Father Burke Gaffney was a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Started the astronomy program. Yeah,
he started the astronomy program, and ironically, the Canadian government used to consult him about UFO sightings. But I found out later that he also had an interest in demonology. So I had contacted St. Mary's University, the lead archive archivist there again. But unfortunately, unlike his UFO paperwork, which there was a lot of good stuff there. There was newspaper article, like photocopied. There was like RCMP reports in his
Oh
paperwork. There
yes.
was
Yeah.
some notes that he had made about UFO sightings. Unfortunately for his demonology stuff, there wasn't a whole lot in there, and I wasn't able to get it at the time because COVID was in full swing, and not even the students were able to get into the library at that time. But I thought it was interesting because demonology is another interest of mine, and Burt Gaffney seemed to have his fingers in a little bit of everything.
He did.
Definitely an interesting character. Now, during all your interviews, did the divers or anyone that you interviewed talk about what the two USOs look like?
No.
They didn't.
No.
Didn't say what they looked like either, eh?
No. But let me give you the insights of a couple of the other people that did give testimony. One of them was a fellow I worked with, and I was shocked because he was Air Force, right? I used to work with him at the Daily News up in Burnside years ago. And when I left that job, I hadn't seen him, and a couple of years later, and again, we're winding the calendar back to later in '93 after I did these interviews with the divers, right? And the book is interesting. The first half of the book is about all the things I did that failed, trying to make some sense of this, because, people might be surprised, but I hated the story. See, I had this idea I was going to really make something of Shag Harbour, and it wasn't going to have all these pitfalls like Roswell did, and I saw the Shelburne story as a threat. I thought, oh God, here's where it gets goofy,
Yeah. It was almost like a red herring, or what we call like a red herring. Yeah.
And but at the same time, you can't pick and choose your data. So I spent the next 29 years trying to find some evidence that it was a true historic event, and it took that long before I did. Ironically, months after I decided I was done. I wasn't going to do it. And I even wrote about it in some articles. I was done with Shelburne. I stumbled into the answer, But here's the thing. I used to work with a fellow up there, and he had a long Air Force career, right? And I hadn't run into him in ages. I ran into him in front of the West End Mall. This is all in great detail in the book. And, he come out, I can remember taking his grandson to hockey practice, and he looks at me, he goes, oh my God, the things you see when you don't have a gun. And we started just talking catch up. And he said, what are you doing now? And I said, you wouldn't believe me. And he said, try me. And I had some papers in the satchel, and I hauled out a couple of the Shag Harbour papers, and he just saw a glance of them and saw a headline with UFO. And he had assumed it was Shelburne I was talking about. And he goes, oh my God, how did you hear about that? I said, well, what would you know about that?
Yeah.
He said, I'm sorry to say I was there. I said, whoa, Jim. I said, you were Air Force. Yeah, he says, but the Navy said kept borrowing me all the time. He was a crash debris specialist. So if a Sea King went down, or a T-33, or they found an old aircraft off the coast, they would bring him out in the ships. And I guess he just hated being on the Navy ships. He went on at great length about that. Didn't like sleeping in a hammock and somebody's socks hanging down on you and all this, right?
Yeah.
So I said, you were there off Shelburne. Yes, sir, he says. I'm sorry to say I was. And I said, well, what did you see? What did you? Oh, don't get excited. He said, I didn't see anything. He said, you know what I did? I sat on that ship a week. Must have been something. He said, they held those ships there a week. I heard what the divers were saying. He said, I read Westerns and I drank beer.
But so says, a lot of the people were probably stuck on the ship and not given the knowledge of what was happening.
That's right.
Like this gentleman here.
Yeah, but here's how he knows. He wasn't told officially. They never even showed him anything. It was the only mission he went on where they never had anything to show him or explained it, And then when they're done, they said, okay, we're going to take you back. You can get the chopper, right? But so I said, so how did you hear? He says, well, the divers were all saying there were aliens below us and 2 UFOs and all this, right? And I'm saying, yeah, he says, every night they were talking about it. He goes, it was weird. I just look at it. And he goes, I tried to ignore it. He says, but man, there was tension on the ship. It creeped everybody out. They didn't stop. He says, it was no joke. They were believing it. And he says, but I decided to just ignore it. But the last day of the mission, Chris, he said, an American protocol officer brought some American officers aboard, and they were meeting with the admiral of the fleet up on the ship, in a closed door meeting. And these guys were wandering around in their whites. He said, You could feel the tension when they went down in the mess, where the bar was, because he said they would make the enlisted men welcome when there was an American war, but they didn't like the officers coming down. So he said this guy wanders in and he hears the divers talking about this stuff in the corner. He wanders over to their table and says, "You shouldn't be talking shop here, and you boys shouldn't be talking about that Russian sub we're sitting over." And one of the divers, the guy who did the most talking, that had told me, he jumped up and grabbed the American officer. I guess it was quite a scene. The table flipped over and really just went ape on him and just said, "Look," he goes, "that's the trouble with you Yankee boys." He said, "You're like, you see the red menace everywhere." He goes, "The trouble is this red menace isn't from Moscow or the Black Sea, is it? It ain't from here." He says, "Could be from Mars. I think it's from a lot farther away." He says, "But I'll tell you one thing. I hope you guys don't have any ideas." He goes, "Those things aren't going to hurt us." He goes, "But if you get any idea of going all John Wayne on it," he says, "we could all be toast." And the officer broke away from him, ran upstairs and come down with the captain. This guy was taken to the brig, right? But this guy, I knew him really well personally. He, on all the years, he'd never talked UFOs or anything of the sort. And he tells me that story. I'd already heard it from the divers, and he named the guy, and he says, they even shot film, and I'll tell you who shot the film. And it was the guys I already interviewed. He says, "I see them at the Army Navy Club. They just nod at me," right?
So you said you did interview the gentleman that had filmed it?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Did
Yeah.
they give you any details, like how
Well,
far
he didn't.
down they went or anything like that?
Oh,
Or
I could tell you how far down, because that's all in the logbook.
so how far down were these
They're
objects?
14 miles off the coast, but they're in shallow water. There's a shallow out there, and that's
Yeah.
where they are. They're only in 42 feet of water.
Geez, that is not much at all.
No. So people, yeah, you don't have to worry about decompression or anything, right? The other
Wow.
thing is people say, "Well, how do you know it wasn't a Russian sub?" You could have looked over the side and seen the conning tower. The other thing is the log would have to mention if there had been a Russian ship or foreign ship of any kind. In fact, in the book, I put a copy of the logbook. I show the cover of it.
Yeah.
In the picture section. I showed the inside. There's a lot of boring text stuff, but if you read it, it says notice rule H1. You cannot, like, it's extreme penalties. You cannot record. You must record a foreign ship or an adversary, in your territorial waters, right? So,
Interesting. Very interesting.
that would be in there. That would be unthinkable not to record a Russian ship there present, right? But there's nothing demanding you report a UFO, right?
That's so interesting.
Now, unfortunately, when he was alive over the years and dealing with the Navy in the past, I never got to interview, oh God, I wish I had, Admiral Kenneth Dyer, who was the guy who was flown to the ship and who had designed this mission. But I did talk about it to Admiral Andy Moore before he passed away from heart ailment, and he had heard the story in that, right? More interesting than that, though, I was not teaching, I was invited to present at a creative writing class. I think it was 94 or 95. And after it was over, a young girl approached me, a very short stature. I can see her in my mind. And, because I talked a bit about Shag Harbour, and at this time, Shelburne was still attached to it because we didn't know when it occurred. And she comes up to me and says, "I know about that story, what you're talking about." She goes, "I'm in the Navy. In fact, I'm a Canadian Navy diver. I'm one of the first." Yeah. And she's, "I've heard the story because I trained with those men who were there."
Interesting.
I said, "Well, they never talked to their family. In fact, I've learned, get this, that the divers who were at Shelburne never talked to the other guys that they dove with on Shag Harbour about it." If you can imagine that. They had no knowledge. And in the book, I explained the proof of that. It's complicated because they did some follow-up reports at the request in Ottawa in 2014 about this.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's quite clear they didn't know. But this girl knew. And you know what she told me? That I'm missing one thing.
What's that?
I don't know. I've tried to find out. I mean, look, I found a lot of the people that were there or had heard the story officially, right? And the typical answer from 9 out of 10 of them was, "We can't talk about that, click," or "I see them." I went back to see this girl because I did see her once, and she gave additional details. They're in the book. I could talk all night about this. There was so much over the last 29 years. But, the last time I went to make contact with her, unfortunately, she is deceased, passed at 42 from cancer.
Oh, that's terrible.
That had spoken to me. But, I found others that were there, including, one of those initial women. These were the women on the Cormorant. It was considered a naval experiment in the 80s. And they had all heard the story because, strangely enough, even though one of the divers who was still training people then and as a specialist coming in and had dove in Shag Harbour and in Shelburne, did not tell his naval buddies in Shag Harbour about Shelburne, did not tell his family, did not tell anybody until me, but he told those young girls he worked with in the Cormorant. I think it was a case of they had a more open mind, but at the same time, they could appreciate the dangers and the lifestyle of diving and serving. You know what I mean? And he told all of them. Although,
I have a question that I think it'll be interesting to ask you. So, with the 1960 Shelburne incident, and your dad was there when Shag Harbour happened 6 years later. Now I know it hit.
Seven.
It did. Or 7 years later, sorry.
Yeah.
I know it did hit the media. There's that famous Chronicle Herald article. Could be something concrete in Shag Harbour, UFO, RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force. When that happened, did that spark, going back, thinking back in your memories, any conversation with your dad? Like, did he start talking anything about UFOs, or did anything kind of jog his memory when that happened?
Yeah. My dad lived until 2011, right? And I would visit him. He lived in Ontario, in St. Thomas, Ontario. And, we would talk about it because he had read, Dark Object at that point, right? And he eventually, he would ask occasionally about it. And I would ask about Shelburne. I'd said, it's in that. And, I can't say it wasn't, but I don't believe there's any connection. I think this is an earlier time and whatever. Do you remember anything? And he would say no. And he said, who's the pseudonym here? That diver, that must be. And I'd say, yeah, you're right. And you knew him, like he knew the divers. You think about it, when you have divers and, they're always in for checkups and medical situations, right? And I knew he was personal friends with the guy under the pseudonym Harry, right?
That's hilarious.
So he said, yeah, and he laughed. He thought that was it. And I said, I remember him come to the house, and I have this memory of being on the floor and you guys playing crib. And I can picture it in my mind because I quite the memory, back for those early years. It's not as good now, but I can remember they couldn't find the crib pegs, and using the old trick where you took wooden matches, and 2 unburned matches were one player and 2 that had been lit and blown out were the other player, and I could, those kind of details, and I can remember them talking about Shelburne,
Interesting. Okay.
to my father. And he claimed he didn't remember, but I do remember that when I was about 20 or so, there's one day he seemed to forget. And when I mentioned this diver then, and I had not begun investigating Shag Harbour, but it come up just from seeing something on TV. I think it was the movie about Betty and Barney Hill, The Interrupted Journey, actually. And he said, yeah. He says, I knew a guy. He said he's seen aliens face to face when I was with him in the Navy. And I said, oh, that was Harry. And he's like, you wouldn't remember him. Oh, I said, and when I started talking about it, suddenly he clammed up, and I realized the mistake I'd made. And he said, I got to go,
Interesting.
So, he knew. When I look at those moments where he kind of slipped up, right? But we never really talked about it, right?
That's so fascinating. I was wondering that when you made the connection, because obviously in 1967, after Shag Harbour happened, that would have generated a bunch of conversation, especially after it hit the Herald there. So I was wondering if you let something slip. Yeah,
Dad was out of the Navy then, in 67. He had a short career. He was only in about, I think it was 8 years or something,
Yeah.
And he went into private business doing all kinds of stuff. He got out. But, and the fellow who shot the film, supposedly the old Super 8 and a sealed thing under the water, he was out. then like he had a short career and had gone on to other things. Whereas the guy who did the most talking, who was the master diver when they'd go over the side was, like I say, he had a lengthy career. That's all he'd ever done.
Now, during your investigation of the Shelburne incident, did you ever come across anybody that got sick, like with radiation poisoning or anything like that from working that file?
No, not that we can say for certain. But I kept thinking, that somebody had, like I say, I can remember Bob McDonald, who had helped me in the very beginning, thought very likely that somebody had passed or gotten sick, that there was some mishaps there, right? And that was it. But I started by, me, like I'm quite thorough looking for, uh, any kind of a record in the paper, but there was nothing, no obits or anything that would indicate you could link to it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm
And
just curious because, well, obviously, anything that comes from space, it's exposed to such high amounts of radiation, and we
yeah,
always hear stories of, abduct. There's some abductees that have reported that they've had radiation sickness, or we've had cases where people have gotten too close to UFOs that they've seen and gotten radiation sickness. So I was curious where it was only 40. Did you say 42 or 47 feet?
40, well, yeah, 7 fathoms. Seven
So,
fathoms what?
you
42
know,
feet. Yeah.
42 feet. And if they're diving down, taking video and stuff like that, I was curious if anyone reported any sort of radiation
Yeah.
sickness or
And you
anything.
got to remember, unlike Shag Harbour, being 14 miles up the coast, nobody witnesses, right? And
Mm,
if you had been out there in a fishing boat, you see 18 ships huddled to get Navy ships, you don't get too close.
mm-hmm.
So there were no civilian witnesses. There's no media coverage. Nobody knew outside of the very few Navy staff, and they were very select, that the divers on the mission shared it with, including, strangely, the young girls on the Cormorant, years later in the 80s, at the so-called experiment they were doing there. Um, yeah, it stayed in-house until they talked to me in 1993. And it quickly got attached to Shag Harbour, and I didn't have enough detail to say it wasn't. And, these guys weren't going to talk. After they talked, they had regrets, of course, and the Navy had clamped down and warned many others. And anytime I'd go somewhere, it was just like they had a little card they'd referred to, it was just verbatim. You'd open the door and they'd go, "Oh, you." And they go, "We can't talk about that." And they would say it. And those, look, Elliot, I get so sick of hearing it, those exact words,
Yeah, obviously they were
"We can't
read
talk about that."
some sort of riot
That's
act,
right.
or that was the
So
media line that they were probably given to tell
So
you.
my
Yeah.
focus attention to try to find a time frame, to try to find the names of the ships, right? Oh my God. And there were so many false leads, and I had so many people try to help me, Americans. I mean, when you read the book, there's a whole chapter about me chasing the Gatineau because it had missing records, and people told me events on that could have been connected to it, and you had to exhaust that, right? And it just went on and on and on. And in the end, I not only hated the story, but I wasn't going to be in the room with it anymore. I was done with Shelburne and this. And then after Christmas the year before last, it falls in my lap. But I mean, again, this is just the beginning. I mean, when you think about it, and I say that at the end of the book, I say, look, do you think you smell a sequel? Well, I hope so. It depends on the further research results, right? But
Yep.
I can't wait any longer to publish. When you read it, it seems a bit premature, but there's some great stories in there. It's amazing. The people I've had this sort of test read it are just like, holy crap, like, and you could back this up too. But there is some need for interpretation. Unlike Shag Harbour, back at that point. I'm back at the beginning. 62 years later, now there are no records, and there's unlikely to be, but there are places to look. There are other people to find, and it's ongoing. In one way, it's good. It makes me young again. I still don't love the story, but I've softened up to it a little. I've warmed up. You know what I mean?
Well,
And
now you're invested in it as well. So when do you think your book will be released? Because
I'd
I'm
say at
definitely going
the
to get a copy.
yeah, I'd say at the latest by April. I'm hoping I'm going to self-publish through Amazon. I'm not going to go the route of a traditional publisher for a number of reasons this time, and the, I think there'll be considerable interest in it, and there should be some controversy too. I mean, they think here he goes again, but I'm saying they're going to have to rewrite some of the history books.
Very
You know,
interesting. I cannot wait to get my hands on that. Um,
makes you wonder what else we don't know, Elliot. Here's the thing: you look at that Pentagon release, right, and that only come out because of the efforts of the To the Stars group there, and Lou Elizondo and Tom DeLonge and those guys leaking that, and then the Americans are like, yeah, well, these things are buzzing around. Yeah, we don't know. Could be something unconventional, but it really happens. These are real objects. They're admitting to that. Well,
well,
they
even just in my lifetime, it's gone from the U.S. denying that there's UFOs and like no accountability at all to they completely admit that there's UFOs now. They don't know what they are, that they're hanging around nuclear. They seem to like or are interested in nuclear installation sites.
ah
They're making more disclosures.
one
So
more re
it's
one
gone a
more
lot. It's gone a
reason.
lot different
Yeah,
than
one more
it did.
reason to be at Shelburne, because Shelburne had another dark secret. They had nukes stored there, lots of them.
Well, could explain all the UFO
Well,
activity
it
going
could.
on there then.
They have admitted that they were storing them at the American base in Argentia, Newfoundland. That's been admitted to. They haven't admitted to it at Shelburne yet. And I can tell you what was kept there was something they used to call Lulus. Lulus, Lulu. A Lulu
Hmm.
was just a code name for a nuclear depth charge. They were about 11 kiloton yield, about half the yield of the bomb they dropped in Hiroshima. You know,
Hmm.
but they had stockpiles of them stuffed at Shelburne, and they weren't supposed to be there, but they were there. They haven't admitted to that yet. They have admitted to it in Argentia, you know, Lulus. Yeah.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Your podcast, do you have any you are a co-host of the Forbidden Science UFO cast? You guys have anything?
No, that's that. We went on a hiatus, and they have not convinced me again to take up that. When this book came up, I'm just so absorbed. I mean, we're just touching the surface here. When the book comes out and read, like I just, between that and life itself and the things you have to deal with, I only have so much time. And I've told them, don't expect me back anytime soon on that, right? But you know what? I'll make time to be with you. I'll make time to be on to talk about my work. But I don't think it's my place to haul it all out of others and expose it to the world like I was doing. It was fun. It was great. Maybe someday, you know what I mean? But there's only so much of me to go around.
No, I hear you. I enjoy doing podcasts. It's definitely a lot more work when you run your own podcast because after this, I've got editing and stuff like that, social media posts to do and uploading and things like that. But I totally get
Yeah.
what you're saying. Is there anything else that you want to? We covered off the your book that's coming out hopefully in April.
Well, like you say, you well covered the expo coming up, and people know how to find that. Uh,
Yes, yeah, I'll
and you
definitely post a
mentioned,
link on our social media. And again, it's Shag Harbour UFOexpo.com
yeah,
for people that are interested in that.
and I'm looking forward to being, and I'll get that paperwork back to you in a couple days here, or
Yeah,
it
I
tells
got a
me where to send it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You can even just email it back to me too, whatever's
Who
easier.
who else have we got booked for that, Elliot? Can you say at this point?
Right now for sure, I have you and I have Daryl Walsh. I did have myself down, but I think I might just do the master of ceremonies on here and make way for a different guest speaker. But we shall see. I don't want to
Yeah.
take off. I don't want to take off more than I could chew just because it is our inaugural Halifax Paranormal Symposium, and I would like to make this once a year annual reoccurring event.
Mm.
But I do have a couple of people in mind. I got to reach out to them and
Well, good. Good.
get back. But it's going to be a mix of topics for sure. You're going to be definitely my UFO guy for sure. And I was going to ask you, I don't mean to put you on the hot spot here on the podcast. You still have time to decide, but I know you've got a few different really interesting things that you could do. And the theme of this year's conference is real case files, real studies, or real personal experiences. And I know you've got obviously your work with Shag Harbour. You've got now the Shelburne USO case, and I know you also have been working with abductee on the South Shore as well. So
Yes,
you have
yeah,
multiple different things that you could talk about. Do you know?
sure.
Do you know which presentation you're probably going to go with yet?
Well, it's going to be probably a combination, but I think Shelburne is so new that that's largely going to be it, And
Yeah. I,
I,
I I think that I think that'll be really good because, like you said, we've always heard about that second
yeah,
story from Shag Harbour. Now you can go, you can talk about it, you can clarify
yeah. And the
some of
only
the
thing that
information.
changes about Shag Harbour is when it gets away that night, we don't know where it initially went.
Yep, yep.
We do
And
know
then
that.
If your book's out in April too, you can bring it
Oh, it
to the
will be
conference
out.
because
Oh, yeah, there.
we're gonna have a vendor table where all the guest speakers
Yeah,
can put whatever they want to sell there, and I'll have one of my PPRI volunteers selling the products for you guys. So
yeah.
at
I'll
the end of
have
the
some
conference,
copies,
that'll be
definitely,
awesome.
sort of
Yeah,
thing. It was
at the end.
time for something new, but I don't write just to write. No one can accuse me of that. I have to have something new to say. It was long enough between books, but yeah, this one
That's
will
awesome.
deliver. It'll be interesting to see. Yeah, and I'll have some of the other one I co-wrote with Graham there too. So
Perfect. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I'm going to make it easy for everyone. I'm going to have one of our volunteers just collect whatever the speaker is selling. Some people sell, I know Stanton
oh,
used to
that's
sell
a great
some of his
thing.
papers.
Yeah,
And then they could sell it for you guys. And then at the end, they're going to
yeah,
keep track
sure,
of everything and
love
then
it.
just turn it over to you guys. And then if anyone wants a signed copy or whatever, it'll
Yeah.
they're already be either pre-signed or they can go and approach you when you're not speaking
So
and get it signed.
where can I find this broadcast when it airs, or do you have a site on?
Yeah,
Uh,
we have a YouTube channel. It's under Dueling Parapsychologist,
Dueling
and
Parapsychologist. Cool.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
can't forget
we
that.
also post it on our social media accounts. And I'll send you the link too, and then that way,
Yeah, sure.
if you're on any groups or
Cool.
anything like that, you can flip it out to them.
Yeah. Like I say,
Yeah.
I'll probably get your contract back there Tuesday, Wendy's or whatever. I know there was some quick instruction. I just gave it a glance there, but
Yeah, yeah, for
yeah,
sure. No, yeah, that's great. Okay, so that'll be good. You'll be discussing the Shelburne USO, and obviously Shag Harbour's going
yeah,
to
and
come up in
I
that.
will deal a little because there's still a connection there, although there should have never been, but there is because one led to the other. It was
Exactly. Yeah.
beginning. But yeah,
I'm glad that kind of you were able to shed some light on it.
but
And
I could talk, if people have questions too, I'm fine going on, getting into a case like Heather's or others. It's funny when you talk about how, the devil thing, I love it when I'm investigating. As you know, I'm not big on like demonology or spirits or this sort of thing, but I do find it interesting from an academic perspective, right? But when I've been looking into cases, I'm always surprised and interested when those things arise. And
mm,
just to give you an example, in Shag Harbour, when the case when I to do with Marsha Coffee, when I found Rex Guy, who was a character who hired Mace Coffee at the Defense Research Board because he wouldn't take the job without some guy there to handle the UFO cases and something else. That was interesting. When I went to discuss him about that, he was the guy that gave me the insight into the Navy, and it's a little hard to understand. They assumed they were real and they had to deal with them in cases like Shag Harbour or whatever, but they were kind of like at the same time extremely disinterested, and they were just thankful they didn't have to account to the public to it. Like it to them, it was of no interest. You just wanted to make sure it didn't interfere with your work or your mission, right? But when
yes.
I went to see him about Meso, he was a great man, and they said, first thing he said to me, he said, the wife and I, we still talk about it. He goes, we knew right away when he died. And I said, you knew when he died? Yeah, he died in the 70s in overseas, in Malaysia. And I said, yeah. And he goes, we knew we were in the Admiralty House and we just gone to bed and we heard a sound like his three-legged dog running around, and we heard his footsteps. And the wife said, she goes, you know what that is? Mace just died. Like it was a poor
Interesting. Yeah.
runner. So you do
Yeah.
run into that stuff even in a UFO investigation, right? And even the
Yes.
guy said, "Oh, I don't care about UFOs," but he insisted he told me about that. So there you go.
That's interesting. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I love that stuff. And
yeah,
sometimes sometimes it does connect. Like for example, I know a lot of alien abductees say that the extraterrestrials communicate with them through telepathy, which actually falls under parapsychology, right? Because we study
sure.
extrasensory perception, which includes telepathy or mind-to-mind communication, psychokinesis, which is moving, objects with your mind, and then, of course, survival of human consciousness beyond clinical death. So, the topics can sometimes overlap, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Some of these goofy sightings, Mace Coffey used to have this great theory that he thought some of them resulted because some advanced extraterrestrial society far from us was trying to communicate with us telepathically, but we weren't sufficiently developed. And the result was all these crazy ideas and sometimes these weird sightings and reality transformations that made no sense. He thought that's what accounted for it, was failed, communication telepathically. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting because I mean, obviously, even in the parapsychological laboratories, there's only certain people that can perform this. So, maybe every human has the capability to do that, but we just haven't honed in on it, or we're unable to do it for some reason. So it's fascinating concept
Yeah.
for sure.
I've had a few instances of that in my life, but when it happens, I'm unaware of what it means, or I don't see it as that. And it's only like the next day or a week later, it becomes evident, oh my God, that's why I did that,
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, like I had a wife one time that got involved in a minor car accident, and I'd never gone to her employment. I was driving around, and I just happened to pull in at the restaurant to see how she was. And I went in, the guy comes in, and he goes, "Don't worry, she's okay." I didn't know anything, and I'd never
Wow.
done that. Things like that.
Yeah,
Just it
yeah,
seems serendipitous, but there must have been some sense. But at the
yeah.
time, it evaded Chris. I didn't feel any urgency. I just thought, why am I going? I'll drop in.
That's so
That's the only
interesting.
time I ever did it. I've had those kind of things a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, I should pay more attention, Elliott. But.
I always say that too. I say I'm the least psychic person I know, but when I think about it, I do have a lot of it's just weird. It's like I'll be thinking of something, and then Sarah, my wife, will mention
Mm.
it. Like we're on the same page, and they've done studies where in the parapsychological laboratory that people that have that psychic connection, usually it's a close bond with somebody else and things like that. So yeah, you never know. It's funny how the mind works. There's just so much out there in the world that we still don't know. So
Yeah,
yeah,
you got to
it's
keep an
interesting.
open mind.
You do, and that's what it's all about.
Just
But
not
listen.
so open and your brain falls out. That's all.
No, exactly. But listen, Chris, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Absolutely.
And
Anytime, Elliott.
it's always a great time. It's always such good conversation. We
Yeah,
could talk for hours about the supernatural and
yeah.
UFOs. But no, that's phenomenal. And yeah, we'll definitely be in touch.
Well, I'm looking forward. I'll be watching your site, and I'm looking forward to the event. And I'm sure our paths will cross before then. They often do. Okay.
The Dueling Parapsychologist Podcast, an educational and entertaining podcast with Canadian parapsychologists Elliott Van Dusen and Daryl Walsh. To reach out to the Dueling Parapsychologists, see our Facebook page, Twitter, and Instagram accounts, or email us directly at info@ppri.net.